Hello and welcome to the 12th live stream of the Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy Series. Today is a momentous day. We've got 5 people on the panel. Let's start it off and introduce a newcomer to this series, but a stalwart of the previous TSSI series. It's the main man, Puya. Puya, how's it going?
I'm doing well, Tom. How about you?
Loving it. Sweltering here in the hottest day of the year.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to talk about politics today, I guess.
Try our best. Okay.
Okay.
Next we have well, I should do reverse. I can't do reverse alphabetical order, so let's just go straight over. Well, oh no, I can't. Let's go over to Sophie. Sophie in deep and hot Arizona. How hot is it over there today?
Tom, you don't want to know. If you think it's hot right now in Ireland, got some news for you, buddy.
How much? What is it?
I mean, it's like at least 90, and it's 9:30 where I'm at. So,
what's 90 in Celsius?
Oh, I don't know the conversion. Jesus, be more American. Come on.
It's like 19-ish.
I think it's about 35.
32. Temperature here. I'd say it's about the same here.
Oh, really?
I'd say
wow,
so.
that's shocking. Is it going to get hotter? Because it's definitely going to get like at least 100 today.
No, like it is about 5 in the evening, so it's about as hot as it's going to get.
Gotcha.
It was. Oh yeah. Well, you might have heard Derek talking there. Derek, welcome back.
Hello, and it is 18 in Celsius here in Utah because I'm in the mountains. That's kind of nice.
Nice and fresh spring weather.
Yeah. Unlike the rest of you guys affected by climate change, I actually have weather.
And that sigh there was, who was that sigh? That was Alexi.
That was me. Hey, what's up? This is Lexi. I'm in some heat. It's not as bad as it is in Arizona, and probably not as nice as Utah. I don't actually know what the number is.
Yeah, the dog robot is in heat.
That's what I said. That's what I said, Tom. You all better watch out.
Yeah, be careful now. Could you get your anti?
I've got 23 Celsius here in Michigan.
23 in Michigan. There we go.
So right outside Detroit.
The feds know where you are now. I'm doing my snitching for the feds again. Okay, today we are going to complete the 6th chapter, Unity in Diversity. We spent the first chapter. Who wants to, Lexi, give us a go there and tell us what the first half of the chapter was all about?
Okay, this was about the United Front and the problem essentially of once you break away from the and the sort of the right wing of social democracy, how do you engage in common campaigns? Because there's still an objective need for the working class to wield its potential for unity, despite the fact that its political expression is fragmented.
Okay.
Was that two Cliff Notes?
Or was that's good. That's perfect. Sorry, because I just had, the last time I had some terrible audio, and I just remembered to myself I should probably try and get the my Audacity to record my goddamn voice.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because the last one was, I'm going to have to do one of these really stupid translation edits, where, and now I ask this question over the top of it. So let me just see if I can get it going here. Is it recording? It is. Okay, so I'm recording now. Okay. Cool. So now he's going to get into he's going to talk about this problem of unity and what happens in what are the contradictions involved in it. So let's have a read of this little bit here. Maybe I'll start it off. Okay. That unity in strength is therefore the elemental and indispensable. Okay, now let's read the first paragraph here. We'll read it all. Okay. The working class objectively needs united action and united organizations. This flows from its underlying nature as a class. We saw this point already in Chapter 1. The proletariat is the whole class dependent on the wage fund, not just the workers who happen to be currently employed, let alone any particular sector, such as industrial workers. Lacking property in the major means of production, workers need to organize collective action in order to defend their interests. That unity is strength is therefore the elemental and indispensable basis of workers' organization. But this need encounters two contradictions. The first is that both capital and the working class are international in character. Okay. Yeah, let me just finish this paragraph. A central statement in the 1864 inaugural address of the First International is still unqualifiedly true today. Past experience has shown how disregarded that bond of brotherhood which ought to exist between the workmen of different countries and incite them to stand firmly by each other in all their struggles for emancipation will be chastised by the common discomfiture of their incoherent efforts. Okay, who's going to translate that last sentence? Let's hand it over to Derek.
All right, so basically that the immediate contradictions within national interest are going to add contradictory tensions within the working class, and thus there'll be pressures to disregard the similarities between, say, the workers of the United States and the workers of, say, Guatemala. It makes all the efforts kind of incoherent because trying to seamlessly fight, I don't know. Let's say, for example, that you convince people that I don't know, that restricting immigration is actually in the local proletariat's best interest, and in the short run, it may seem to be. In doing so, you will be pitting elements of the proletariat against itself because A, parts of the proletariat had come over from other countries in the first place. B, it's not in every sector's equal interest to actually have strong immigration limits or strong tariffs. And C, capital is going to move transnationally anyway, and as soon as you do that, it's going to go to another country. And if you try to restrict that in any significant means, you're going to end up in all kinds of problems of capitalist autarky, which usually leads to rapid impoverishment because of an acceleration of the decline of the rate of profits.
Yeah, like the way I like to think of this is that the post-war class compromise, the racist, sexist class compact, nationalist class compact in the United States, like that, set up redlining and set up all kinds of things, that there was a real short-term objective interest for like a great section of the American working class. And you might even say there was a medium-term, like great interest in doing so because their kids lived well. Then their grandkids are fucked. Like even in this case where there were very strong economic factors at work that made this class compromise a good decision for a large section of the working class, and particularly the representatives that had the ability to make the decision. In the long term,
and not to plug a reactionary journal, but American Conservative actually recently published something about how white flight wasn't all just about racism, based on these trend lines, these economic trend lines, that was more Marxist than most Marxists are. And it makes almost the same point, that the social compromises that made suburbia ever profitable in the first place as a means for redlining and all that, that didn't last 2 generations. And so a lot of the run both out of and back into the cities has mostly been economically motivated, almost explicitly, not just let's get away from the brown people.
Yeah, I think you can
by personal racism.
I think you can explain it in terms of a depreciation of the fixed assets of the houses. with profitability of investment. So, as the urban areas develop and, the ratio of, the organic composition increases there and profitability falls, you can start to develop in suburbia. And then once the assets inside of a city depreciate, then, you can have investments start once again.
Yeah,
you can have, I think this also explains gentrification. But yeah, what are you saying?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I also think, well, the funny thing about gentrification is I was reading scientific studies about that, and it doesn't actually even hurt the local property owners unless they rent. But that was going to be hurt either way. Because if things don't go, I mean, I don't realize a lot of people rent, but a lot of people actually, a lot of the working class, more than a lot of socialists think, do own small property. Technically, like they own it from the bank.
Like a house.
Like a house.
Yeah, like a house.
Is that small property?
It's not classical productive property, but
it's not. Yeah,
it's hard to say it's not some kind of property.
Well, there's a tendency right now.
Property. It's property by definition.
It is property. It's just not productive property, and also you don't really own it.
Productive capital, you mean? Like
exactly. Yeah. A lot of people, when they say property, they're not really talking about things that we might think of as personal property, and that extends to fucking domiciles. Which I don't know. The whole debate is a bit staggered, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's weird because you have a lot of people arguing that distorts the consciousness of the working class, and maybe it does. I don't know, but anyway, the point in that is those assets follow patterns, and those patterns had already happened in Europe, even though Europe never had the same kind of developmental of suburbs. But the suburban patterns and the reversal of it actually had mirrors in European city development, and we should have seen it coming, but we didn't. And explaining that totally by white flight misses the fact that there are areas which didn't have the racial demography where it still happened. Which is not to say that there isn't like both structural and even individual racism in it, particularly in the setup of redlining and all that. There definitely was. It's just that's not actually a good explanatory mechanism to explain everything. So whenever you try to play that up when you're talking about the class as a whole, you're going to automatically be pitting people against each other in interest in ways that's going to it might make total sense in the short-term run, but it's going to completely shoot yourself in the foot in a generation or two. And honestly, there's all kinds of both left and right compromises on these issues. I mean, I think, and I might be upsetting some people here, but Keynesianism does a lot of the same stuff on a national level.
Why does Derek always think I'm a Keynesian?
I don't. You're an MMTer, but there are Keynesian MMTers and non-Keynesian MMTers, so I have to be careful.
I'm not an MMTer even. I just think that their analysis on money is correct, but like I'm not a Keynesian, and I don't think it's a solution.
I might agree with that. I might agree that they're correct about money.
Here, let's keep going anyway. We're getting a bit sidelined here. I think maybe a little bit, maybe not. Let's go on. Who wants to read this next paragraph?
I can.
Who wants to? Go on then, Derek. In a finite time.
I will read it slowly.
Not an infinitesimal.
However, there are within the workers' movement nationalist socialists and trade unionists loyal to the existing individual nation states. The result is there is a contradiction between the unity of the working class as an international class and the unity in any one country between nationalist and internationalist. The point is well made in Lenin and Zinoviev's Socialism and War. Unity with the opportunist actually means today subordinating the working class to its national bourgeoisie. Alliance with it for the purposes of oppressing other nations and of fighting for great power privileges, it means splitting the revolutionary proletariat in all countries.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the good old days, that 1914 through 1918 Bolshevism. It's tasty stuff.
It's funny how people seem to take the opposite conclusion when using Lenin's imperialism now, except that they do keep onto the great power criticism, but not the rest of the stuff about splitting about subordinating the working class to a national bourgeoisie.
Who are you talking about when you say that, Derek?
Most Marxist-Leninists.
Well, do you mean specifically their analysis on like quote unquote the third world, or just in general?
Not just that. Like there's this in general thing that they have, for example, in all nations, but like the quote unquote core, that comprador bourgeoisie are worse than national bourgeoisie. So they basically say that the international bourgeoisie is worse than the national bourgeoisie cause reasons and imperialism. And this is specifically and explicitly justified in Maoism, where they say that the contradictions of imperialism are greater than the contradictions of capitalism.
Yeah, I knew that about Maoism, but that's kind of surprising to hear about MLs. But I guess I don't talk to enough MLs, which is
the MLs are all infected with Maoism now. Anyway, I mean, like the difference between what can you like for example, what groups do we think of in the United States that are still MLs?
Well, yeah, PSL comes to mind, but they are definitely influenced by Maoism as well. I get what you mean.
Yeah, every group with
Like
the
actual
CPU essay
theories
that I can
like
think of.
Lenin and Stalin versus Mao are there's obviously some differences, but in practice, what we consider the difference between what we consider your garden variety ML and your garden variety Maoist is different. Is not that different.
Somebody is touching their mic. I don't know if it's you, Derek.
I can't touch my mic.
Okay. Somebody, maybe it was Sophie. Was it you, Sophie? Were you banging your mic a bit?
No, my mic is on my table, and I don't think I was. Sorry.
Oh, okay, grand. Yeah, doesn't matter. Who knows? I might be losing it. I actually have got an ear infection. I've got tinnitus, so I am hearing like.
Oh no!
I went to the doctors, and I was at the receptionist, and I just rang up to say like, I can I have an appointment? And she said, yeah, if you come quick, you can get one straight away. So I cycled up there, and I got there, and I went up to the woman at the desk, and I said, oh, I'm here for the appointment. She said, oh, it's Tom O'Brien, is it? And I said, yeah. And what's wrong with you? And I said, well, I'm hearing noises in my ear. And she looked at me like, she's like, oh, fuck, this guy is gone, he's gone schizo.
Like, you're at the wrong clinic, honey. The psychiatrist's office is down the street.
I know. And I was like, no. I was like, I got like a kind of a whistly sound in my ear. And she was like, oh, that's all right. Okay.
Oh, God.
That's funny. Okay, let's move on a wee bit. Okay. The next section, he's going to get through into the second contradiction that he's going to get into, which is basically the character of how political parties under capitalism work and what that means for organizing and strategy. Okay, so let's have Puya. Let's have a go here. You read the first paragraph there if you can see it.
Okay, the second contradiction.
Yeah.
Okay. The second contradiction is a little more difficult to explain. We can take it at a high level of abstraction or much more concretely. In abstraction, a workers' organization, whether trade union, party, or whatever, is not an unconscious organic unity like a family, clan, or peasant village. It is a consciously created unity which grows out of, negates/preserves the individualism of modern capitalist society. In this aspect, it foreshadows a future freely associated producers of socialism. But to be consciously created unity, it must inherently be a unity in diversity, an agreement to unite for partial common ends while recognizing the diverse individual opinions and wills. It is indeed the partial convergence of the individual opinions and wills which form the basis of a possibility of a consciously created unity. Is that good?
Okay. Yeah. So
Okay.
this is I'm reading Gary. Derek, you're typing or somebody's typing. Mute themselves. I'll mute him here. Okay, there he is. So I'm reading actually Marx's Critique of Politics, Gary Teeple's book, and he's going into some of the Marx's early works, and this sounds like it's directly taken out of that book. You know, talking it's quite Hegelian in his language here, but he's talking about how, you know, actually, I'm going to shut up. Somebody else talk about it. My brain's not working today.
I think I know where you're getting here. It's the it's a kind of like integration without engulfment. That is this higher form of freedom that preserves, you know, organic unity and the individualism of modern society. Like,
Yeah,
it's not
it's the only way.
It's not an unconscious organic unity, I suppose, is in his language.
Like Marx is getting to, like in that early work, Marx in the stuff I'm reading there, Marx is getting towards this idea of an organic unity where things aren't disparate. Your own individualism is reflected in the totality, and
right.
We're going to get into like that's why Marx thinks communism is like the synthesis or whatever. It's the future because it allows the individual and the society to basically form a like a unity, and they're not opposed to each other like in bourgeois society. So he's gonna keep going here. Let's keep going. Like all of this stuff is pretty good. I think this is very good analysis. How about Sophie? Do you want to take these 2 paragraphs?
Sure.
Actually, these 3. Let's try 3.
Okay.
Or 2. Let's see how long we go. Fuck it.
Okay. I'll read what I feel like reading. How about that?
What the fuck? Yeah, read 2.73 of them. Okay.
All right. 2.73.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Keep track, everybody. This dialectic of individual and consciously creative collective necessarily entails the possibility of collectives within the collective where, as is inevitable, there come to be disagreements within the larger collective. At the level of the concrete, a workers' organization of any size and geographical extent cannot run under capitalism on the basis of a pure distinction of tasks from meeting to meeting among members who do them in their free time. In the first place, the capitalists simply do not give workers enough free time except in the form of pauperizing and demoralizing unemployment. In the second place, though we seek to make everyone a worker leader, worker manager, or worker intellectual, synonyms, call them what you will, in fact, our ability under capitalism to overcome the petty proprietor intelligentsia monopoly of education and managerial administrative skills is limited. In practice, we have to have full-timers, and these are neither members of the intelligentsia managerial middle class, petty proprietors of intellectual property by background, or, if they organize as workers, become intelligentsia by training as full-timers. Full-time office itself can, moreover, be a type of property in the form of privileged access to information. These 3 paragraphs really stood out to me when I read because it reminds me a lot of like my experience in organizing, especially with like anarchists, and he kind of gets more into like a critique of anarchism a little later. But essentially, with any kind of working class organization, regardless of like what ideology, this is a dynamic that's really hard to control for. And I think it's what you can extrapolate from this is kind of how the dialectic of like the individual and the collective, how that's kind of like foreshadowing the future society. This also kind of foreshadows some future problems you're going to have, because I think that's something you saw in like the early Soviet Union, where this dichotomy between, well, it wasn't just the early Soviet Union, but the dichotomy between, you know, quote, skilled workers or whatever versus unskilled workers comes to fruition and can create a class or maybe a pseudo class situation within that society. And so we have like a mini microcosm of this, but what actually makes it worse in a capitalist society is that capitalism supports these divisions. It kind of feeds into that, if that makes any sense. And so he's highlighting like a really huge problem and contradiction within workers' organizations.
And they don't stop when you get out of quote unquote capitalist societies either. I mean, that's one of the great debates between like all the different theories of the Soviet Union's collapse, which was hinted at the beginning, that you still had all this technical expertises, and there really was kind of a new class around that. What I fail to understand though, and you peeps can help inform me on this, how are these contradictions dealt with by the ideological allegiances that he's talking about? Because they seem fundamentally different.
What do you mean by that? Can you expand?
Could you elaborate on your question, please?
Well, the whole left right center orientation of the various communist movements, not workers movements here, doesn't really deal with this question in any meaningful sense.
No, that's a good point.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead. I didn't really. Go ahead.
I guess the only thing I could say to that is this undergirds his love of the councilists, or at least his respect for the councilists, I should say, because
I can't hear you.
Baby cut out.
Yeah, Lexi's gone.
I guess to kind of
she's back.
Pick up.
She's back.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Party. Oh, I'm
Lexi,
sorry.
can you start again? Yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
You're just talking about the council com.
Yeah. So McNair, even though he's coming from this Leninist background, has a respect for the councilists and the council communists because their emphasis on undermining this dynamic, their hypersensitivity to the idea that organizational assets are part of class and are part.
You're breaking up again, babe.
You're breaking up again, Lexi, just there a second ago. I'm going to start your router again, or
the hell out of my internet.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna electrocute it with my face tentacles. Be right back.
Yeah. I don't know how I feel about this. Like, he's talking about what is it? Intelligentsia as a class. Yeah. I don't know if I really like that, because like, does my professor, is he a petty proprietor because he knows some differential equations? I don't really think so.
It's not necessarily. I guess when I said skill earlier, and I used scare quotes with that, but even then, like, that's not really the proper way to conceptualize it. What can potentially make somebody who's part of the intelligentsia, middle class or petite bourgeois or petty proprietor or whatever, is kind of like
they sell their books.
Yeah, like rents, basically. You could even I do streaming, right? And so that is kind of like a form of that in a sense. It's like a renting out of entertainment. Although obviously I'm not making petty proprietor money doing that, but you get the gist of it, right?
Well, and I also think a portion of your income goes to whatever streaming service you have, right?
Yeah, but that's true. That's true in any situation. I mean, like, that's even true for like classical capitalists. They lose stuff to other capitalists. I mean, like, this is a problem, and it's a problem in Marxist class analysis in general, where you want to say, well, professors and stuff are wage earners. Ipso facto, they are proletarian, except they do kind of have the capacity to reproduce what they do without the wage, through a system of complicated rents. And
what is that exactly?
So if just given lessons,
IP, you can go directly with this. I mean, technically what we're doing right now is petty proprietorship. I mean, and saying that it's not because Google takes some fees or does advertising is also be saying, like, because the internet takes advertising for Google, they don't count either. It doesn't work. So,
like, I think here, like, we're getting into kind of technical discussions about this from a capitalist point of view, from like a Marxist capitalist point of view. But like, I think what he's making here is a point is not in a capital sense, but he's talking in a more of a power sense, that like certain intelligentsia will have, by nature of their skill, will have a social power. Now that power it's not like, it's this idea, I hate the term, but like social capital. They might be able to convince more people to do stuff because they've got better analysis or stuff, but it's not like they're making money on it. It's just showing that there's a power differential.
You may
hate
what
I was trying to get at.
Capital, but when you organize, it is a real fucking thing. I mean, in reality, like,
I think it's real, but I'm not saying it's not real. I'm saying it is real, but we're not talking about it in it's a money thing.
No,
you're right.
It
You're
may
right.
be, but yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think we want to get
an extreme circumstance if it's about money, but
Yeah.
in reality, it's about power.
power.
And
Yeah,
basically, the general gist of what McNair is getting at here is that the people who could be leaders in workers' organizations generally have enough resources to be able to spend a lot of time doing that. Whereas if workers who are dependent on earning a wage to survive devote that same amount of time, they're most likely either going to burn out or they are going to lose their job.
Yeah, and this was true historically too. I mean, we talked about this last time that the leadership of almost all the socialist parties until they're fully instantiated almost can't be working class because it's a full-time job. And McNair actually goes into this. He's basically validating the anarchist critique, but then saying the anarchist solution, which is what, like, for example, the IWW does, is, like, the anarchist solution is to say, okay, there's no full-timers and everyone's volunteer. Well, what happens? No one can commit to do anything competently. And that's
or there are de facto power relations that anarchists tend to ignore. And that's like one of my biggest problems being an anarchist, a former anarchist who organized with anarchists. This was rampant. And it tends to lead to like petty mini sectlets within, or at least it did in my area, mini sectlets of anarchists who all hate each other. And like 1 minute they all hate each other, the next minute they're like, oh, we need to like work together and set aside our differences. And really it's just people pointing fingers at other anarchist quote unquote leaders, even though they're not leaders, right? Or
yeah. So I'm hoping Lexi can chime in on this, because we've actually dealt with this in a real organization. But one of the theories behind McNair's critique here that I think was interesting, but I've never actually seen work, is that the full-timers have to be democratically accountable so that they can be recalled and disciplined by the membership if they go overboard, because we still need them. And that's the idea here, is like, instead of the tyranny of structurelessness or the domination of the petty bourgeois, you have to have an accountable organization to actually do this. And I don't here McNair doesn't deal with it, but Lexi and I really thought about this. When most of these organizations that talk this way, when you go to do anything, they structurally work the same way as all other.
I think it's like I think it's just of any type of society that has any level of complexity to it, you've got division of labor. And with division of labor, you're going to run into this problem. Doesn't matter how you do it. You just want mechanisms for reducing the excess, or for basically having full control taken away from those people in positions of power. Like, how many of these truck groups are, have like executive committees that basically the only way you get removed from them is you die, and they just determine the strategy. 5 or 7 or 8 people determine the strategy of like that sect until it implodes.
Well, you got to imagine that a lot of these truck groups are very small, and there's some validity to anarchist critique and like kind of organic sort of Bordigist thought that when you have a small enough group, decision making doesn't necessarily need to be as formally bound by democratic checks, at least to produce like decent results, what have you. And when you try to establish these decision making things on a small scale, where everyone's decisions like have a large weight, more or less, like anything that you are trying to prevent can take hold very easily. And that's also true when you scale way up, when you have, something like, this is kind of a stretch, but like a Democratic Party or a presidential election, the institutions warp everything. There's a bunch of dynamics about who even bothers to participate. So I think that what he's describing is, at best, practicable within a certain threshold that most left groups don't actually get to. And if they do get to, you don't actually see mass democracy, like, because they've learned as small groups that were successful enough to blossom and get big, basically to avoid democratic accountability. and those types of people do not like to segue towards. It's just against why they're there. Those positions select out people that are willing to relinquish control to a democratic body. So this is an elaborate argument to say that I think this might work if it could be tried, but there's a lot of reasons that it never really. It's never implemented in a project that's important enough.
Well,
and I guess
if you ask me, like, sorry, I was just going to say, if you ask me, this is sorry for interrupting. Like this point that we're making here is the reason why the DSA took off and all these other ones didn't, because it's closer to this.
Yes and no, but the DSA
I'm not saying
is not
exactly.
But the DSA National isn't accountable to its members at all. It's not.
Yeah, but think about what happens when somebody in you're sitting in the middle of Tallahassee or somewhere, and you want to be a socialist, and you say, "Oh, let me check out my DSA chapter," and you go there, and people aren't like Iron Discipline MLs or whatever. The people are just like going, "Yeah, I kind of like Bernie or this, that, and the other," and it kind of feels right. And that's why it grows.
It does until it doesn't. Yeah, here's the difference, though, Tom. I've actually been to these meetings, and so their steering committees end up getting dominated by the same groups that were sectarians in private. I mean, like, so that's one thing. They changed their bylaws so that this can happen for another. And on the third thing, the National Committee is remarkably stable, remarkably unaccountable. It's very hard for any one group to unseat any of those people. They're only accountable to each other, which means that it looks like it functions this way, but in practice, it really doesn't at all. It functions very similar to the way coalitions of sectarian groups functioned before, except now they're not calling themselves coalitions of sectarian groups. They're calling themselves the DSA.
No, fair enough. But I totally take those critiques on point. But I'm talking about like why it bloomed.
Well, yeah, I think so. But then there's also the oppositionist to Trump element to why it bloomed, which does complicate that. I mean, like,
yeah. I think it's probably a mix of these factors, but like, why did they all go there than the PSL or some other, ISO
also,
or something?
the DSA is much more right wing than a communist party.
Not the American Communist Party.
Yeah, the American Communists are actually they were Bernie's unrealistic. We have to support Hillary in the primary.
Yeah, that's true. DSA to the left.
I mean, like an actual communist party,
like a real communist party. Yeah, no.
Yeah,
point taken.
I mean, the DSA would be the right of the McNair's right-left Marxist spectrum for the most part.
I think you're right. Yeah,
but
definitely. Just to kind of give like another counter example to like the DSA in Redneck Revolt, there was this kind of an attempt at this, but the key difference is that because Redneck Revolt was, while it was nominally non-sectarian, it was in practice an anarchist organization. You had leadership positions, but they revolved around doing specific tasks. And you still have this dynamic where it was the people who had the ability to do this, that kind of work, who always ended up taking those positions. What was interesting was that it generally wasn't necessarily petty proprietors. There were usually women who did all the unattractive administrative work, and they were already had a lot of shit going on their plate, and they did kind of experience a lot of burnout in a lot of cases. And then when things went wrong, they were the ones who people would get mad at, generally. Mm-hmm. But the issue with that is that these people in these leadership positions had no real authority. They were just elected to do specific tasks. And I think in some ways that might have been useful, but in other ways it kind of it hurt the organization as a whole, because when people were acting really shitty, there wasn't a whole lot anyone could do about it. And that was kind of my problem with it as I was leaving. My biggest problem ultimately was that all these tanks shouldn't be here, and if you would stop being such an anarchist for a second, maybe we could kick them out, you know? But I don't know.
Yeah. I wanted to like actually call back the IWW, because the IWW did have a debate internally about full-timers, like 100 years after, you know, syndicalism is like their like lifeblood. When they started doing some successful union efforts in some service industry places around some, you know, like new left hotspots, like, you know, so it's kind of sui generis stuff. It's not totally exportable, but you know, they did organize a few workplaces, the IWW. They did it on the basis of full-timers, and they did it on the basis of getting, you know, labor contracts, something that the IWW also always opposed. So you can see that even when like the IWW isn't officially anarchist, but they're certainly the most prominent organization of like labor anarchism or social anarchism and syndicalism, which has overlaps with anarchism. Like when that organization takes its own problem seriously, it comes to Marxist conclusions. It's something that emerges out of taking the problem seriously. And I think what McNair is saying here, and something that the councilists stumbled upon as well, is that we're not just talking about power. This is actually an element of class. This is part of class. And if you read Eric Olin Wright, he has these like institutional assets and like this sort of authority as part of his class, as part of like one of the ingredients in class, as one of the important vectors that alters, you know, how property relations affect agency. Like this is important. And
sorry, go ahead.
It's important for Marxist reasons. It's not just anarchism. It's not just a critique of power. This is a kind of asset that somebody can lord over somebody else in any kind of in many class societies, but especially technological class societies, as Tom says.
I just want to say too that, or add to that, it's really interesting you brought up the IWW, because when I was giving these criticisms of Redneck Revolt before I left, the IWW was actually brought up as an example. And from what I remember how it was described to me, it sounded like this kind of McNair idea of democratic accountability. And it, I don't want to spill too much tea, but it essentially evolved like accountability of like leadership, and how the alternative, there has to be some kind of middle ground between, you know, hyper anarchism where everybody is just free to do whatever they want, which is not what most anarchists don't want, versus like call out culture being used as a bludgeon for political opportunists.
Real. That's the political economy of call out culture, yeah.
So
well, one thing I wanted to get back to slightly was the point that Derek was making about how these organizations end up in the DSA, say, end up actually happen. How they end up working in real life is that you get like the more dedicated, say, becoming into these committee positions of powers, and most probably, by the sound of it from Derek, a lot of these people have come out of, you know, Trot or ML groups. So, like, to me, there's like a historical, cultural way of politicking in those groups that, honestly, that has to just kind of die. I feel like I'm hoping that all these type of sects will slowly die, and that style of operation will be, that kind of memory, organizational memory, will be lost. Like, just looking at, say, Irish politics at the moment, right? I was looking at some of the polls there the other day. The Civil War in Ireland was like, what, 1921? It's nearly 100 years, okay? And if you look at Irish society, it's only now, the two main parties that were for the Civil War parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, were both kind of centre-right parties. And they used to get about 80% of the vote between the two of them. And it's only now, 100 years later, that those two together are down to about 50%, which is probably more like standard for most European countries where the right-left divide is taking effect. Like, so, you know, there is this organizational memory of all these organizations and truck groups and ML groups and Maoist groups and whatever type of groups. Like, it literally might take 100 years of death of those existing things before the new thing can bloom. Is that too depressing?
No. It's I think you know what? Having seen the new wave of small bean Stalinists, I think that this isn't going to simply die out.
No, that's
Oh
been
my god, being Stalinist. Sorry.
But I mean, like, for real, like, if we saw small bean, and I'm not saying that they're morally equivalent or anything, but if we saw small bean small bean Nazis come up, then the fact that we see small bean Stalinists tells me there's some kind of historical echo here that we haven't really dealt with. And I mean, I am going to just point out that like ML friendly media, while there's less of it, is kind of popular right now amongst leftoids, including within the DSA itself.
Yes, it's true, because people have gotten lost in history again, and so they've faced, you know, the Kautskyists and the Mensheviks, and so where do they turn? Right?
Right, but they want to stay in the Kautskyists and Menshevik groups is what I don't understand. So, like, you I mean,
what media are you talking about?
Marxist Center.
What media?
All right.
What media?
Go and look at Patreon downloads for Socialist Podcast, and you will see that the largest Patreon base outside of the professionally produced ones out of New York is Revolutionary Left Radio. Now, that is not just a Marxist-Leninist podcast. I don't want to disparage it in that way, but it is the most uncritical and most kind to them. And it is the largest second-tier podcast on the left right now. First tier is all professionally produced, mostly out of New York or tied to magazines. It's like Majority Report, Michael Brooks, the Chapo and all that. Right. But the second tier podcast, which are the people in like the 500 to 1,000 Patreons, and you're gonna multiply their listenership by a factor of 10. And I mean, I know that because I work for a podcast that's in that tier. That's the largest one right now. So there's not as many, though. I mean, this is the other thing. There, as far as the other left-wing podcasts, there's like 50,000 ranging from Leftcom all the way to normal Democratic Socialists to various trot groups have their podcast. And there's like only a couple of ML ones, so it might be a function of concentration. But it's a real thing. And a lot of the groups that were designed, who weren't designed by MLs. I mean, one of the funniest things in history, you mentioned the PSL. They have erased their own history as a Trotskyist party. Like, I mean, that's like something that everybody who's been in this game kind of knows, and nobody knows from right now.
The SWP, the official organ of the Fourth International, did the same thing in the United States under Sam Marcy.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know this. That's crazy.
The PSL and the WWP are descended from that explicitly. And one of the things that got me worried about this book, honestly, when I read it, I brought it up several times, is that McNair thought that the Marcyites were one of the best forms of Trotskyism. And it was under the auspices of their willingness to try to bridge the gap with other forms, and their descendants in the United States are what now?
Okay, can you? I've heard the term before, and I kind of remember this being brought up. But can you explain Marcyites and why McNair thinks they're the best truck?
Well, he doesn't think they're the only best. I mean, honestly, he mentions two groups: the Sparts and the Marcyites. And the Sparts are the most sectarian, and also most anti-imperial, but they're the most sectarian group. And then the Marcyites tried to bridge. They basically had this theory that most of the divisions that separated Stalinists from Trotskyists were no longer applicable after the 1970s. And so reaching out to Maoists and then to other MLs would be a way to like re-bridge, get everybody back into the same tent, and more importantly, in some ways, to the theoretical reasons for this are a little bit vague to me, but it started off with the defense of Cuba and then started spreading. So first we needed to defend Cuba. Then we needed to make a common allegiance with other, post 1968 forms of socialism, many of which were anti-revisionist or ML. So we need to make concessions because those distinctions don't matter, particularly when fighting U.S. imperialism, because U.S. imperialism is the most important issue. And so like critical military support for, say, North Korea became critical support for North Korea, became just support for North Korea. And the core of the leadership of these Marxist descendant parties actually erased their historical relevance to Trotskyism and embraced the they literally took 1940s Communist Party propaganda, anti-revisionist propaganda, and made it their educational program.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now.
And think about who these people were reacting to, right? There's a kind of Trotskyism that tends towards social democratic reform, a sort of humanist Trotskyism, and unfortunately Max Shachtman, who is a great Trotskyist at one point, drifts in this direction to the point where, Derek, correct me if I'm wrong, like he effectively supports the Vietnam War, right?
He supports the Vietnam War, enters the the SPA, and is effectively the reason why the SPA dissolved, creating the precursor to the DSA and the current SPUSA.
Right, and so these are the trots that like the new atheists, evolved from.
Yeah, and like a couple of them actually became explicit neocons. Only one or two of them that tendency tends to be exaggerated, but it did happen. So they're responding to that. Now, what McNair says, and this seems to come out in the early 2000s in relationship to him doing this in the 90s, and there's a background to his own group here. The CPGB Provisional Committee, PCI, yeah.
PCC?
PCC.
Committee?
Yeah.
PCP?
Anyway.
PCP.
Whatever.
What is PCP?
That's that good stuff, Tom. You gotta be puffing on that for sure.
Yeah, no, because I remember I used to play this like drug game. It was like some really basic fucking Unix character-based game, and you could buy PCP.
Nice. PCP does interesting things, but
Derek, personal experience.
Not personally, but I've seen it.
Okay.
The
reverse
funny,
beep beep beep.
The funny thing about this though is, that this group is a split from an anti-revisionist party, so they actually kind of went in the other direction. So I always thought it was interesting that he mentions neo-Marcyites, because I'm wondering, and this I just don't know, if they had a completely different trajectory as a microsect in Britain than they did in the United States. I don't know. And so, because basically the journey that the CPGB comes out of is the opposite journey. Like they basically were anti-revisionist. They made common cause with some trots, and it ended up being their own thing.
Okay,
That's all fascinating. Wow.
Like that was an. I must say, we've kept the microsect analysis down for most of this so far, but that was like 20 minutes hardcore microsect. So that's it for today. Let's move on.
Oh, yeah.
Like I'm sected out.
I feel you, but anyway, so that's a history of American Trotskyism.
Yeah, I wanted to start a podcast called "The Joy of Sex," but it's already been taken.
Well,
You should, you should do. We should do more. So Swampside has been leaving that aside. We should do more joyous acts. I would love to do that.
I told you guys about about a book. It was in when I was studying maths. There was in the maths library. It was called The Joy of Sets. That was one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's lovely.
It was like one of these Springer Verlag books. It's a proper actual book. Lexi,
Oh, wow.
do you want to
Yes.
have a go at reading these two paragraphs, and we'll kind of see if we can sum up this. We can get through this little micro bit.
Yeah, let's see if we can see ourselves out of the micro swamp. There are several potential elements of such a road, but the main point is this. For the working class ranks to subordinate the middle class officials to themselves, it is utterly indispensable that the ranks have the freedom to organize without the say-so of the officials. We have already seen that organization is indispensable to the working class pursuing its interests. This is just as true within the organizations that the working class itself creates as it is in the larger society. This leads to the same conclusions as the first and more abstract point. To retain its character as an effective instrument of the proletariat as a class, a workers' organization must have the freedom to organize factions within its ranks. Indeed, the struggle of trends, platforms, and factions is a normal and essential means by which its differences are collectivized and a unity created out of them. It must be a unity in diversity. Unity in diversity can be denied to the movement in three ways. Bureaucratic suppression or exclusion of dissenting factions is an obvious one. Equally obvious is the ultimatist refusal of unity for limited common action where that is possible, on the basis that there is insufficient agreement on other tasks. The third and less obvious, but equally common, way is to fudge differences by diplomatic agreement to windy generalities, or to self-censor and thereby pretend that there is more agreement than there actually is. It is this last course of action with which Marx and Engels attack in their critiques of the 1875 Gotha program. Ding.
Okay, so let's see. There's three of them here. So there's the bureaucratic suppression or exclusion of dissenting factions is an obvious one. Okay, so we can't deny. We have to allow factions. Okay, and the second one,
no faction ban.
No faction ban. Okay. So 2 is equally obvious is the ultimatist refusal of unity for limited common action, where that is possible on the basis that there is insufficient agreement on other tasks. So that we should be able to come together with people for particular tasks and organize with them.
Yeah, so Lefcom suck it.
Yeah.
And that's a little more complicated than, is making it out to be in today's environment. It's like you have some people would have a hard time, let's say, cooperating on a pro-abortion action with a transphobic feminist group. You know what I mean? Like that would be a hard sell even to me. But I think in the left, you sometimes have to deal with these sorts of things as long as people are willing to cooperate.
See, actually, this is what I don't get. I actually don't understand a split from the right based on this right here. The second point, the equally obvious ultimate refusal for limited common action where possible on the basis there's insufficient agreement on other tasks. Part of the issue with that seems to me to be that since most of these are activist organizations working together actually does imply tacit agreement with them on other issues. Since there's no framework for a united front to exist where those things can be hashed out.
Well, I think this goes back to this earlier, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but it goes back to McNair's earlier points on how it wasn't explicitly said, but it seemed sort of implied that well, actually it was explicitly said. The conversations about being able to be critical of right-wing socialists if you're going to organize with them in that united front sense. Kind of like the first example he gave at the beginning of the chapter was how Lenin told British communists that it was fine to be part of the Labour Party as long as they have the ability to be critical and agitate for their own views, if that makes sense. So I think that's kind of solved by that. I don't necessarily agree with that perspective 100%, but that's the McNair answer, I believe. He's walking a very fine line here. Anyway.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what he means. Like, yeah, you can have common action, but you have to be able to voice your differences. And I think he kind of marks the border of where you cannot go. Is fudge diplomat. It was with the next one. So he kind of wants that middle area between cooperation and like subordinating yourself to the right.
Before we move on to that third point, though, I want to kind of like address something Lexi was talking about just now, with like the Jesus, my brain is not fully working.
My hypothetical example of participating on
doing pro-abortion work with TERFs or whatever. I think like, to me, the easy answer to that hypothetical and similar hypotheticals is that you have to have certain limits, obviously. So like you can generally work with different orgs, or work with different people who might have things you disagree with, but you shouldn't block with fascists on anti-imperialism, obviously. That's like another hypothetical.
Right.
And I think like as long as we have like certain like we will have unity for limited common action, except in certain special cases.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I even picked TERFs because I think they're, to me especially egregious. Like, if let's say there's an anti-imperialist rally or something, and there will be fascists there, you know what I mean? Like, how do you handle this exactly?
Well,
like,
right.
I know that.
You beat the shit out of them. You beat the shit out of them. You get yourself a 2x4. You put some nails in it. You run up behind them. You get them in the back of their knees, and then you stab them in the throat.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but what I was going to say too is that like there are obvious.
Not going to stop the war.
Well, yeah, of course, but what was I going to say? There are obvious like scenarios where like if you don't know TERFs are at like the pro-abortion rally, you know what I mean? Then like you can't really do anything about that. But there's a difference between people just showing up to something versus like intentional planning for an action or intentional planning for a common cause with people who hold these views. If that makes any sense.
Well,
like if anarchists show up to an anti-imperialist rally and you don't know that they're neo-Nazis, there's obviously nothing you could do about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
AKA the story of Occupy outside of certain areas.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know though. I actually am still kind of like there does have to be some kind of grounds on which you actually do say that the cost of being seen as unified with a group, even on the left, is greater than the cost of working with them on a limited option in an official capacity. Now, in an unofficial capacity, it's different. But this does seem to be saying that this is within a official capacity.
Right. That's I think what he's saying. And so I brought out that example. Maybe it's like an extreme example, or it's like question begging or something. But is that something that we actually agree with?
Yeah, I think maybe these are extreme examples, but they're not implausible ultimately as far as like IRL organizing. Like,
yeah, that sounds perfectly plausible in, say, Ireland, right?
Right. And so like I think it's fine to have this as a general rule of thumb, but to say with certain people or certain orgs or certain ideologies or whatever, you'll make an exception to this because the cost of working with them in an official capacity is just too great.
Yeah, that makes me feel better about it.
Okay,
it wasn't obvious.
I've got. Oh, sorry. You go ahead there, Puya.
I was just gonna comment on the factions and the unity and diversity. Yeah, when I was in my experience, when I was like first getting into leftism, I would go to these sects, and that would just really bother. I just did not. I still don't like it at all. That there's a party line, and everybody must follow this party line, and there's just no opposing views. That's just something that really bothered me, and still does.
Instant
And that's all I
turn.
have to say.
Well,
do you know what bothers me is when, like, during the summer it gets bright really early and I don't have blackout blinds on my windows and I wake up early. That bothers me.
That happens to me all the time.
I'd like to say something about this third and less obvious one here about how we can't fudge our differences by diplomatic agreement to windy generalities or self-censor. And he kind of quotes Marx and Engels on their attacks at the critique of the Gotha program here. But did Marx and Engels not censor their own critique?
Right, they did the very thing he's saying you can't do. I mean, they censored this, didn't publish it for sake of party unity.
Yeah.
Even though, I mean, and even later when Engels is critiquing the effort program, he sends his critiques to Kautsky privately, so that when Kautsky writes his explanation of the program, that Engels's critiques are subtly like built into the interpretive rubric, which thus actually changes the meaning of the program. But it's even there it's not done in any like. It wasn't. We know this all from historical stuff. It wasn't that known at the time.
Come on, Beards. Disdain to conceal. Disdain to conceal. It's your own damn words.
Did the daddies let us down? God.
Jeez.
But like, I think like when it comes to this stuff, I think about, this is kind of political strategy in some sense. Sometimes I don't think if you're a military strategist, you don't always say attack is always correct in this situation. It can be correct and then not correct, and that it's not like the problem with it is that you can justify anything by saying the conditions are different. But there is a truth to that. And like, I think that if Marx and Engels saw, oh, look, this is going to create a massive socialist party and it's going to grow. And then they say, well, let it grow and then let us try and influence it. That could be the politically correct thing to do. I don't know how hard and fast this rule should be.
Well, in my opinion, I think I understand the reasoning for why they did what they did, but I think history didn't absolve them. Like, I think it might not have necessarily changed anything if they were allowed to be as critical as they wanted of, the early SPD, or its precursors.
They were allowed. They just didn't do it for their own reasons. It's not like somebody was stopping them.
Well, okay,
that's so
wrong phrase.
Weird.
But my point is that they.
It's an important difference.
My point is that they weren't absolved by the direction that the SPD went. Like, the SPD became what it became, and so I'm less inclined to want to make exceptions to this one personally. And I think another kind of interesting example of this that isn't necessarily what McNair is talking about, but kind of a similar problem, is that you had this was like the thing within Rennick Revolt. Like, you would fudge your differences and agree to windy generalities. And maybe I'm being a bit harsh there, but the difference is that I believe McNair is talking more about unity with right-wing socialists, and that wasn't necessarily the problem in Rennick Revolt. The problem was that you had a hodgepodge of people who honestly didn't get along, and then it blew up in our faces. And realistically, like, there was no official rule against making factions, but it was kind of poo-pooed for people to make factions. Like, if you had like international Marxist faction, Stalinist faction, and like a anarchist faction, or you tried to start that, you'd be kind of looked down upon as being too theoretical. You know what I mean? Or too concerned about
Right.
ideology or whatever. And it wasn't like a direct suppression of democratic differences of opinion. People debated and disagreed on things all the time, but there was a limit to how much you can officially have disagreements. And they were a lot of times they would try to be like glossed over. And I think in the long run that really hurt the org rather than helped. And it was done under the idea of like the anarchist abuse of praxis, where, you know, we're all about doing action and all this nerd shit is useless.
Okay, I'm going to make an executive decision to keep going because we'll never get the fuck out of here. We've only done two pages. 2.5 pages in about an hour and a half. Fuck's sake. Right. Okay. Let's keep going. This is bureaucratic centralism versus the United Front. Okay. So I'm going to read here. I'm going to read the next 5 pages straight, and then we can all hang up. How about that? Okay. Let me read this bit here. Okay. In effect, the policy of the United Front was a struggle for unity in action of the whole working class, combined with the open expression of differences. And this is an objective need of the proletariat, not merely for the second period, the restabilization of capitalism in the mid-20s, but under all conditions. But a deep grasp of this question eluded the Comintern. Both the history of the split and the 1921 adoption of the ban on factions precluded it. The history of the split meant that half the justification offered for the split was to purge the workers' movement of opportunism. This justification is obviously opposed to any form of unity, even partial. The logic of the idea that a split would purge the workers' movement of opportunism was expressed in the sectarianism of the third period. The ban on factions was itself a direct denial of the need for unity in diversity in the communist parties and Comintern. The effect of this ban was that the communist parties came to replicate Blanquist groups or the secret Bakuninist dictatorial conspiracy of 1871. Right. A bit of a burn. You know, like Leninism as Blanquism or Bakuninism. You know,
I mean, not wrong.
Not wrong, but like what's so kind of obviously depressing about this is that this party form was designed for a war. They said, "Oh, the final battle is upon us. You know, go to the barricades and we'll overtake these capitalist pigs or whatever." And that, like, this idea that we're still stuck in this middle of this, you know, death grip battle with capital is so goddamn absurd at the moment, and that we have these political parties and groups that still behave like they're in goddamn wartime communism. Like, it's so goddamn pathetic. It's fucking depressing. It's so goddamn depressing that when people are interested in socialism or communism, they go to one of these things. This is what they get. It's goddamn, it's so obvious to anyone with 2 goddamn brain cells. Rant over. Who's next?
Well, I mean, it's just hard to accept that if you take this left, center, right dichotomy, the Bolsheviks are throughout their whole, well, until the Popular Front, for most of the time, they're a leftist strategic deviation. They want to skip part of the strategy of patience and take advantage of the war. You know, they have principle of selective opposition. They'll be opposition in some formal places, and they'll, you know, abstain from others. You know, they're kind like, it's too heroic to fail. You know, it's not. It's too much. This is something I've been trying to account for. This sort of like Blanquist and Bakuninist overlap, it's kind of weird. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. One doesn't, I don't know. And so it doesn't appear to people as being like a right-wing deviation, because through this strategic thing, it's, strategically speaking, it was sort of a leftist deviation. Anyway. Was that anything?
Maybe
Lexi,
we
sorry.
keep reading.
Lexi, do you want to take this bit here? Hello?
Sure,
Can
sure.
you hear
One
me?
moment. One moment. Yes.
Sorry, no, because my internet did drop out, so that's fine.
Should I read it?
Yeah, read it.
Yeah, you
Do
should
it.
read
Okay.
it. There's noises right now. Hold on.
I can't see that well. What sentence do I start with? The Comintern.
The
Let me
comment.
find it. I can't find it, unfortunately.
Page 111. The Comintern
we have
leaders
different-
have quite properly asserted.
Well, maybe somebody else should read it, because I
Um,
can't find it at the moment.
It's on the screen. If you've got your computer, you can read it. It's shared.
Okay. The Comintern leaders had quite properly asserted that the United Front was not a permanent policy, but a road to the reunification of the workers' movement on a higher level, represented by the Communist parties and the International. But the character of the Communist parties post-1921 regime meant that they could not express the proletariat's class need for unity and diversity. On the contrary, the bureaucratic dictatorship of a socialist right was now paralleled by a more ferocious bureaucratic dictatorship of a Communist Party apparatus with its head in Moscow. Maybe could you scroll down a bit?
Sorry, yeah.
No?
Should be, yeah.
Okay. Once the Communist parties had taken this form, the natural inference was that real unity and diversity was actually impossible. The unity in the party could not be unity and diversity. Therefore, neither could broader unity. This left the only choices available to the radical separation, third period, or fudging diplomatic unity, in which the communists self-centered to conceal actual differences between themselves and their left socialist or trade union leaders. Okay, maybe that's good.
Okay. That's good stuff, isn't it? Like, once they've gone this way, this idea of unity and diversity was never really going to work, And the other thing is, like, posit this Communist Party form versus Marx's writings on, like, what was McNair talked about just at the start of this chapter. Remember I said it was kind of Hegelian stuff. Where is it here? This unity and diversity.
Yeah, I kind of love this Hegelian stuff. Whenever I read things that are non-Hegelian and then I come back to it, I'm like, this is wonderful.
It's like a warm bath.
Yeah.
I hate reading it, I must say.
It's kind of like really bong rip sometimes, but at other times,
Yeah.
but I like what it's trying to do, like how it's trying to like capture the dynamics and the complexity and everything.
Well, when it's done right, it's lovely. When it's done wrong, it's like, shut up, hippie. I don't care.
like sometimes it just sounds like nonsense, but a lot of times it's just like, wow, this is great.
Well, when it's done wrong, it like shakes my faith in the overall enterprise and makes me think the cool stuff is fake too, which is the problem.
And often when it's done wrong is in Hegel himself, which is also problematic AF. And I don't mean like the core text that everyone talks about, like the shorter and longer logic or the phenomenology, although the phenomenology is never honestly translated most of the time. All the religious associations in the languages that are apparent in German are dropped. But read his lectures on the history of religion, and you're just like, the stuff from the critique of the right and stuff is not, or the philosophy of the right is not actually as deviationist as people seem to think it is. So the Hegelian stuff is great, but also maddening, and that goes back to Hegel. And I think, Lexi, you're secretly like a fangirl for The analytic, are not so much anti-Hegelian, but post-Hegelian or analytic Hegelian synthesis thinkers. Like even in philosophers, I tend to like Brandom, who's like, let's actually do Hegel but right this time, which is interesting. But yeah, I say this because it's good stuff, but also it ends up being prose poetry a lot of time without a lot of meaning. So
I find it very difficult to read. I find the language, like I find if I have to read some Hegelian speak, it takes me like a day. Literally, it takes me about 2 hours to read, or an hour to read about 2 pages. When the concepts aren't that hard, but it's just the language just destroys me.
Yeah, I feel that too. I hate the way that a lot of Hegelians and Hegel himself sometimes talks. It could be explained much better.
Okay, so what do people think about all this stuff here then, about this idea then of like bureaucratic centralism and the United Front, and why it couldn't work?
Well, I think ultimately, I think, and I don't know if McNair necessarily means this or would agree with this, but I think, to me, what this says is that functionally, the Leninist parties become the new right wing, or a different version of the right wing of socialism. That's what I mean. If they have a ultimatist kind of veto on the workers' movement, that they function in the same way, do they not?
Well, I agree with that intuition, and the way that I could say that while preserving his sort of like thing is to say that like the left, center, right axis isn't the only important like axis. Like there's a possibility of a leftist option, sort of more or less, becoming a more vicious dictatorship because of what I would say like is like state form, or like what is the proposed kind of society that's being like what's on offer as the proletarian state, what's on offer as the next society.
So you mean, bourgeois conceptions of a singular unitary axis may not be totally universally applicable in all contexts? Oh my gosh, no one's ever said that before.
Yeah, specifically not Herbert Marcuse. Yeah, Herbert Marcuse never said that in the 60s. That's right. But seriously, because, again, until the Popular Front, Leninism is a leftist deviation and a vicious leftist dictatorship. But even in the orthodox Marxist strategic spectrum, and so, yeah, that's when I think of it on paper, I'm like, oh, vicious leftist dictatorship. Finally, we have our own. But in practice, it also does eventually, Sophie, lead to the right in the Popular Front and beyond. But
it leads to the right in the Popular Front, and then it also leads back to capitalism. It's been just historically shown.
Right. Yeah. The right. Yeah. The right underneath it all is making peace with capitalism, basically. But I still think it's interesting that when you get anti-revisionists in the 60s, some of them take on this like permanent third period mode thing. And again, by this orthodox like Marxist strategic spectrum, they adopt a species of center left or left-com strategy, and they have this, hard tank thing going on. So maybe they feel this way about party organization and strategic questions, but then they also think that sending in the tanks was cool. So it's just a different axis of difference there.
It explains how you could have like new left Maoists that kind of have a whiff of anarchism about them, but yet also are
precisely. Yeah.
All right, is it time to keep reading?
Okay. Yes. So sorry, I was muted there. I was trying to talk. So we got the last little bit to do. Okay, let's see if we can smash through these. We've done 3 pages, I think. No, we've done 5 pages in the last hour and a half. So let's see if we can do 3 in the next 15 minutes and get out of here. 20 minutes and get out of here within a reasonable time. So he's going to get on to here with Trotsky and the United Front. let's see. So he's okay. Well, let's try the first two ones here. Derek, do you want to give one a go? Is he still alive?
Sure. So the Trotsky? Okay. Trotsky was intimately involved in the creation of the Comintern policy of the United Front. A great deal of his political struggle after he lost out in the battle for leadership of the Russian Communist Party was focused on it. His writings on Britain and China in the 1920s attacked the Comintern's diplomatic unity policy. Between 1928 and 1933, he battled in print against the Third Period sectarianism. In 1934 to 1938, he contraposed the Workers' United Front to the Comintern People's Front policy, and at the same time battled against the diplomatic, fudging unity approach of the London Bureau of Left Socialist Parties and of many of his own co-thinkers in the international left opposition and its successor organizations. But Trotsky, in spite of participating in the Russian left's 1920s criticism of the party regime, never escaped from the contradiction between the United Front policy and the 1920 and 21 thesis on the organizational character of the communist parties. He internalized formally the idea that before 1917, Lenin was right and he was wrong on the party question, and clung to the policies of the first four Congresses of the Comintern as an anchor in the shifting seas of policies of the grouplets outside of the mainstream of the socialist and communist parties. And as a side note, I've always found this fascinating because the very structure that Trotskyists often critique on these questions gets maintained. So, for example, the slate voting stuff, which Bolsheviks didn't do before, I believe, 1921. Which clearly was part of how Stalin got in power. Trotsky took over to all his organizations because he maintained all those structures.
Yeah.
Explain that structure. What you mean by the slate?
Well, so you vote on whole slates of who run. You don't vote on like individual positions. You vote whole slate, open ballot. Everyone knows who votes what way. So if you lose, you can be retaliated against, and particularly later on, removed from life. And this was actually, and you still have socialists say that this is like actual proper accountability. Like I've heard even non-ML say this.
So you vote for a slate for you just vote for. So when you say, explain it in more detail to me there, because I didn't get it.
So like you vote for like the party secretary, you vote for an entire cabinet. So so when you vote for his like head party secretary, you also vote for him to have assembled his entire cabinet, so there's no opposition within the cabinet and they can all work together. It's also part of the faction ban.
Oh, that sounds like an incredibly dumb idea.
Well, that's how almost all these parties work that way.
You don't say. It was a dumb idea. You don't say.
Well, what does that what does that tell you about what Trotsky was like?
Unfortunately, like a lot of the great like Trotsky texts, because I used to be in a Trotsky and I would read some of the later Trotsky and be like, that's pretty good. How come he's like not held in better regard? I mean, he's just a massive hypocrite. Like it just stains so many of the good documents of the left opposition is that, you know, when Trotsky was in power, he wrote terrorism and communism.
Yeah. Okay. So basically Trotsky, we'll see here. Trotsky started with microgroups. When they got bigger, they tended to Bolshevize their parties, creating an overt or covert dictatorship of their petty bureaucracies. To such organizations, a real commitment to unity and diversity of the workers' movement was as inconceivable as it was to the Stalinists. Unity had to be diplomatic. The alternative was sectarian self-isolation. Okay. This stuff is just, he's going to go through here all the reasons why, you know, all these examples of more sex stuff that I said we wouldn't go through. Maybe
skip this part.
Let's read this part here. Yeah. Do you want to have a go?
Me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But the history of Trotsky's struggle for the United Front policy meant that even in sectarian isolation, the Trotskyists tended both to detach themselves to attach themselves to sections of a mass movement while self-censoring and hiding their own banner, as in the Labour Party entry and similar tactics. And B, to create fronts which purported to be united fronts of the left, but were in fact bureaucratically controlled by particular Trotskyist organizations. The Helioites, the All Trade Union, the International Socialists, SWPs, rank and file movements, the Lambertites, the Lambertistes, Parti des Travailleurs, Workers' Party, and so on. The Mendelites actually constructed a theory which justifies diplomatic unity. Ben Said's /Jabrach, dialectique de unité de brodimento.
Oh my God. Fuck's sake. What's that? Fuck me. What was that?
Baguette. Oh, omelette du fromage.
I thought you were I thought for a second there you were ordering a cup of coffee and a baguette.
Oh God. I mean, I think I'm bad at French.
Omelette du fromage.
I feel vindicated. That's all I have to say. Is I feel vindicated.
Americans, what the
Did
fuck?
you guys ever see that episode of Dexter's Lab where he's like,
Yeah.
omelette du fromage? Yeah, you did?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It was the only thing you could say from the whole episode.
Or the episode of Inside Zero Books where I pronounced Gilles Duvet's name 5 different ways in like one sentence.
I thought you were talking about 5 different people. Who's this Duvet and then it's Duvet and Dubon? What the hell?
I promise that I'm probably pronouncing it wrong anyway. And I just did an episode on Duvet. I'm pretty sure I'm saying it wrong.
Howdy, y'all. You want to read some Duvet?
I will say that honestly, until this last little paragraph here on the Mandelites and Tony Cliff, I don't know what he was talking about. Like I was like, oh, but I know who the Mandelites are and I know who Tony Cliff is. But before then, I was long strains of French gibberish.
Okay.
Yeah, I did not know. I did not know any of this. I was like, this 2 paragraphs. I just went totally over my head. But I know who Mandel is, and I read Mandel's book on the long waves. It was pretty good. It was pretty decent. But okay. Anyways, the dialectic
There is a
of
Mandelite.
unity.
Sorry, there is a Mandelite party in Ireland that has got 3. Actually, I'll talk about it in a minute. Let's keep going here.
Okay. Dialectic of unity and overflowing, or outflanking. The theory was plagiarized by John Ross and Tony Cliff and thereby found its way into the common sense of the British far left.
Is there anything that Tony Cliff didn't plagiarize? Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, should I read another paragraph? Okay.
Keep going. Let's just push on through this.
In this theory, the United Front is a tactic and one applicable by a small group, rather than a policy for the whole of the working class. Diplomatic unity with the reformists or a section of them makes it possible to set the masses in motion in a particular struggle. The Trotskyists then demonstrate to these masses that they are better fighters for this particular struggle, and or they will not draw back from carrying this particular struggle to the end. As a result, the mobilized masses then turn to the Trotskyists. The theory justified diplomatic unity because the masses break with the reformists in action, not in ideas, with the implication that they do so in relation to their particular struggles. Unity with reformists is essential to set the masses in motion, and on the particular struggles, it is unnecessary for the Trotskyists to offer sharp criticism of reformists, which might prevent unity. The masses struggle will find the reformists out. Okay, I think that's good for talking now.
Yeah, the ISO actually functioned this way. So.
Well, in Ireland now, there's the Irish, there's the Socialist Party, and they are actually a Mandelite party. They're a member of Mandelites International, and they got 3 TDs in the Dáil, so they got 3 MPs essentially, out of 166. So it's pretty good. They have they're doing quite well. Best, probably as good as they've ever been. And when the IMF came into Ireland, when the shit hit the fan in the economy, a part of the bailout with the IMF and the EU and the ECB was that Ireland would have to privatize their water. Okay, and between this party, I think, and one other small trot party as well, there's two small trot parties. They managed to stop the privatization of the water. Like, it's a hell of a big thing that they managed to do. And how big is the party now after an amazing success like that? They're exactly the same size. Okay.
Oh, sad.
Yeah, and a major, major, major victory for it. Okay, but so this idea that the what does it say here in action? What was that last bit you read there?
Yeah, the particular
Inaction, not
struggles.
ideas.
Yeah, in action and
Well,
not ideas, right? It doesn't work. You know, if it would work in Ireland, you would have seen a massive bump, right? Between the two parties now, after an incredible victory like that, I think they've got 6 seats between the two of them. Okay, and probably going back before that happened, they probably had 4 or something like that.
Were they like the only party that supported it?
They were the driving force of it. Absolutely. I'm not sure if other parties actually supported it. Certainly, the big political parties would have been for privatizing.
So we don't have anything like that on the national level in the United States, but we did have something like that on the local level in the United States, which was the 5 for 16 struggle in Seattle in specific, led by the one socialist city council member in the country for a few years, which was a big inspiration for the DSA. And they operated under the same auspices. And guess where all the membership growth happened? Again, to complicate this, it's not as simple as the IRS case. But all the growth seems to have actually happened in the DSA. The SA hasn't been able to really, which is the group that actually spearheaded the SWAT campaign, actually really hasn't been able to benefit much from it outside of the initial win in Seattle. So apparently just this doesn't work. Also, it's just not honest. It's also not really honest. I mean,
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah.
This is Popular Front and rebranded in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess my kind of thoughts are like the general gist of it. I actually kind of get and sort of agree with, but there's 2 things that bug me, and these kind of are things that bug me with Trotskyists in general. Is that it's not honest. And McNair will get into this a little bit later, but when he talks about how these parties discourage their members from like getting involved in other struggles, like they became very single issue focused, that doesn't make a lick of sense to me either, because when you organize with people who aren't like radicalized or whatever, and you're interacting with workers who aren't like woke, they're not solely single action usually, you know what I mean, or single issue usually. Like they usually care about more than one thing, and so that just doesn't. That seems so out of touch,
Look, I think one of the big problems with it is that when, say, in the Irish thing, when it happened and people it worked, and I think there's one of the most limiting factors is that when people really meet these trot parties and they get involved with them, they don't like them, or they kind of piss them off in reality. That even a party that's like, the size of the Socialist Party in Ireland, like, they're essentially a trot sect, just a reasonably successful one. And they have the exact same behaviors that annoy people about these groups. And their strategy of organizational form is self-limiting more than anything else. It's self-limiting.
Right, yeah, I would definitely agree. That's kind of what turned me off of from trot parties and so on. Yeah, so are we going to continue?
Okay, yeah, here, try this paragraph here. Puya is eager to smash through this. There's no French words in this one, so you're okay. Okay, we'll just do this one paragraph.
The underlying problem is that oh, sorry, Lexi, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just saying I want to read some French words. That's all.
Let's have
we
Lexi
can do
have a go.
we can do better than me. Huh?
Let's give Lexi a go. 'Cause you're after doing about a page there. Let Lexi in here
Oh
now.
yeah. Oh, there's some
Okay.
good French words that I could butcher. All right,
We'll
great.
tag team.
Yeah. Tag me in.
How
Don't
come
get attention.
Americans can pronounce Russian names no fucking hassle and Polish names, but goddamn French ones do them?
Because fuck the French.
Freedom fries. Freedom fries.
We're not liberals. We don't hate Russia. Okay. The underlying problem is that it is a variant of the sub-Bakuninist mass strike strategy discussed in Chapter 2. Once the masses, or even quite small layers of newly radicalizing militants, actually begin to enter the political stage, they demand of the left not good fighters on the particular struggle, but an alternative political authority. At once, this poses the question of a party in at least the Kautskian sense. This requires addressing the full range of questions affecting the society as a whole. Followers of the Ben-Said-Jabrock versions of the United Front are inherently obsessed with action as the road to overcoming the reformists, and therefore debar themselves from offering such answers. They also hold back militants who wish to go beyond the narrow aims of the particular struggle. The result is that, far from turning to the Trotskyists, these militants turn to parties which are prepared to offer broader policies.
Yeah, this whole thing with action is like so reminds me so much of like the things that turn me off from anarchism, even like better anarchism. And like, look, I'm not uber nerd. Like, I do think organizing is great and fine, but even with like the anarchists who aren't hyper insurrectionary, they get this kind of attitude of like, oh, if you're not doing mutual aid and involved in your community and doing action, you know, whatever that means, then you're just some kind of nerd. And there's like kind of this implied masculinist kind of like only faggots read books, you know. And they wouldn't say that,
true,
but
true. It's true.
I mean, I'm down with that. They're not wrong, I guess.
That's division of labor for you.
Yeah, the fags go here, and then the real men go over here. That's fine.
Yeah, my local anarchists are also like that. We have like an IWW branch here, and they're not very fond of reading books. Put it lightly.
There's
It was just an abusive practice. But to bring it back to this whole thing with the Trotskyists, it's hella ironic that Trotskyists are falling into the same kind of behavioral patterns. And in this paragraph about them being so focused on like a narrow topic seems even worse than anarchists. Like, not only are they doing that weird masculinist posturing, they're doing it stupidly. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
and what's also strange about it, honestly, and I've noticed this book actually explained this tendency to me because I never could figure it out before. Why Trotskyists in practice, like they gathered their cadres and sent them off doing whatever particular action thing, while they're like secretly hoarding all the left opposition books ever and like running publication and conferences about them, but they don't teach them to their cadre members at all.
Yeah,
this is the reason, because they don't think it's important until the future. They think it will be important after all the masses just wake up and side with them, maybe.
and then that never happened.
well, they don't really believe in the strategy. It's bad faith in motion. If they believed in the strategy, they would teach their militants this stuff, and their militants would be better for it, right? Because it's a good strategy. It's worth teaching.
No, I mean,
they don't want people who can argue and, you know, free thinkers. They want,
right. I mean, like, it gets in the way of like selling newspapers and stuff. Well, they wanted troops at one point, but that hasn't been true since the 60s. But the reason why most of these groups are falling apart now is their scandals. But their scandals aren't new. They've had them. I mean, I'm sure for every like horrible rape scandal we've heard of out of a Maoist or Trotskyist group, there's 50 more going back to the 60s we don't know anything about.
Yeah,
100%.
And so like that's not the only reason why all this stuff is falling apart. I mean, that's a part of the reason why, but other reasons why is like their money making strategies are I mean, like if you look at what the ISO actually did, it was the same stuff you can do in the DSA plus Haymarket books plus maybe historical materialism conference plus be involved in your own special cult. I mean, I don't know. And that wasn't true historically. That wasn't true probably even in the 90s, but like that's where this led. This particular focus clearly led there. And in countries where maybe they were smaller, maybe there was a more advanced working class, it wasn't as bad. Like Latin American trots don't have the same feel to them the way the British and American trots do, but it didn't seem to matter.
Yeah. Well, yeah, part of this is like class character of organization apart from success. Because the thing about like Latin American Trotskyism is that, you know, in Argentina, there were stakes in Latin American Trotskyism. You know, workers had a stake in it in a way that didn't happen in the United States for the most part. But like you're saying, it didn't change everything about it. It doesn't change some of the deep structure of Leninism or, you know, 20th century Marxism and what have you. Like, I don't know. It's kind of like saying even if it does work, we're still in trouble because it's inadequate.
Okay, I'm going to read this last little bit because I like it. I'm going to finish it off and we can have our thoughts on the end of the chapter then. Okay, the version of the United Front defended by New Left Trotskyists has another and equally disastrous character. The Comintern policy of the United Front is about unity of the working class movement as a whole. It is not about the sort of blocks of grouplets and prominent individual leftists which New Left Trotskyists call United Fronts. Such blocks and agreements may, of course, be useful tactics, but dignifying them with the name of the United Front provides an excuse for sectarianism to present itself as non-sectarian. It also abandons to the reformist right the idea of unity of the working class movement as a whole. The split between communists loyal to the working class as an international class and coalitionist socialists loyal to the nation state will never be healed as long as communists insist on organizing to fight for their ideas. Huh? What? Let me see. Does that make any sense? Is there a word missing there?
No,
Let me read it again.
To me.
Okay. The policy of the United Workers' Front is therefore an essential element of strategy in the fight for workers' power. But this policy can only make sense as part of a larger struggle for unity in diversity. And this struggle is a struggle against, among other things, the Trotskyist concept of the United Front. Okay, who wants to talk? Derek.
Maybe I'll say something. What is the grouplets he's talking about? The blocks of grouplets. What is he referring to exactly?
So you might have a united, like the Marxist Center in America now, a few sects getting together.
Yeah, or the various times, like International Answer is another one from years back. Coalition
International, maybe.
Well, sort of. I mean, yeah, the Fourth Internationals ended up being, but the thing is, most of the Fourth Internationals didn't stay groups of sectlets. They became sectlets themselves. So, like, that's why I used to make the joke about how many Fourth Internationals does it take to screw in a light bulb? Because.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah, I mean, like, because you have something like the 37th Division of the Fourth International or whatever, and I'm only kind of joking. And so you did have a lot, particularly in the 60s, where you had like coalitions of anti-revisionists and like new left trots who like didn't try to like recapitulate the party, but they would also do stuff like join en masse, like a group like the SPA, and like form coalitions within them. And we've seen it's very similar to what's going on now. So yeah, it's not only, it's kind of problematic, but this is the criticism of like grouplets of left unity, where the unity is between groups, not between mass organizations of workers in a party.
Okay, great.
So what's he saying here? This sentence here kind of threw me a bit there reading it this time. The split between communists loyal to the working class as an international class and coalitionist socialists loyal to the nation state will never be healed as long as communists insist on organizing to fight for their ideas. Does he mean just like actions and that critique of the trot party form?
It's kind of like there's no use in suppressing these differences. These differences are important. We have to cop to these differences, even though we might need to angle towards unity on actions. We can't like fudge these differences. This is an important strategic break. You can't just fudge the difference between nationalist, like socialism, and international communism. Like,
so what do people?
There's a difference between what Bernie Sanders wants and what I want, and that's organizationally important, even if you're working on the same thing.
Bernie Sanders wants a Zimmer frame. Let's be honest.
I'm sorry. I think the internet got wobbly. What did you say?
I said Bernie Sanders wants a Zimmer frame. Let's be honest.
Bernie Sanders wants this dick.
Oh,
That's a leftist deviation, honestly.
Bernie Sanders not wants the Zimmer frame.
Oh my God, we're so sorry.
I love y'all.
That's
What is a Zimmer frame, though?
That's not a leftist deviation. That's a leftist deviant.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh hey, get me.
So before we wrap up, does anybody want to say anything about the chapter as a whole now that we're finished this thing?
Well,
I think. Go ahead.
No,
someone else
go ahead.
first.
Somebody else. Oh,
Okay,
well,
I was just
Go ahead, Sophie. Sorry.
Okay.
And they were all bottoms.
I was just gonna say, I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about like how to practically apply this, and what kind of came to mind towards the end of this chapter with me is that at this kind of like weak point of the workers' movement, because like Derek loves to say, right, like the whole thing with the mergers formula is that you have to have like a working class movement to merge with, right? And so it's hard for me to imagine how to formally apply some of these ideas. And so the thing I've come back to is that as far as like how to apply these in organizing, you have to be basically informally open about your disagreements. So like if like in Arizona, for example, there's like a lot of good like solidarity and like kind of nonprofits for people who are refugees. And so and a lot of the people in this like doing this activism are like liberals, right? So I think like when discussions of these kind of topics come up organically, you just are honest about what you think, and it's still not, it's okay to like avoid confusing jargon or buzzwords that might be scary to people, but it's still good to be able to explain your views in a way that's understandable and in a way that will be honest about disagreements with them. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
That's my big takeaway for practical application.
Honesty about disagreements is a really succinct way to put it. Like specifically these, this distinction between socialism, quote unquote, and this is more of a problem in Europe and actually in the rest of the world than the United States. Even though it's becoming a problem in the United States, it's becoming a problem because of a good thing. Basically, the sort of anti-communism of years past has sort of broken a bit. And so that's good, but it's bad in that it gets more confusing. We had a more accurate lay of the land when people couldn't tell the difference between socialism and communism, and so they banished democratic expressions of socialism. Like in a left communist way, it left things starker. It left the contradictions more heightened, you might say, in the anarcho-Maoism. But now we kind of face the same issue in the United States. if you live in a more, quote, progressive area. If you live in real-ass America, you probably have the same damn problem as always.
Puya, were you going to say something before?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks.
Derek?
I'm just as I don't know. I feel like this chapter clarified some of my skepticism about other groups, while also making me wonder if this was actually an answer to it. Because the fundamental question still sort of remains: isn't this kind of starting at step C? Like,
What do you mean?
Like, is this the half rethinking that McNair is criticizing in the rest of the book?
Right. I mean, like, the half rethinking, it's still accepting a whole lot, and it's still it assumes conditions are operable from times past that I don't know that are operable even in the UK or in the Nordic countries where there are much, much stronger union presence. I mean, and so it's hard for me to know whether or not I think this is something we should be skeptical of, or something that's just really premature to articulate right now.
Yeah, I think this is really underestimating the current weakness of the workers' movement, even considering what McNair says at the beginning of the book about how our current time is more closer to the mid to late 19th century than it is to the early 20th century, in that similarities in the weakness of the workers' movement. They still essentially had, at least in the last quarter of the 19th century, they still had a international. I mean, we ain't got shit compared to that, realistically. You know what I mean?
And the international was a response. It was like in concert with self-activity. It wasn't all
exactly
constructed.
So I think there is, maybe if we're taking that at face value about being similar to like the early 19th century, maybe there is a horizon of workers' self-activity that might help build like an actual workers' movement we can merge with. But as it stands right now, I think a lot of this is too in the future. And I think Derek is essentially right in that, like, this is like we're at this is like assuming step C instead of step A or step 0. You know what I mean?
Well, I suppose it's not just about America. You know what I mean? It's totally just about communist strategy worldwide.
I think this is just about Britain, and I'm not even sure this is true there. I mean, like,
not now, probably.
Well, the point of the exercise that he's doing is, if there are like lessons from the 20th century, this is what they would be. And I think we can assume a bunch of the conditions that he needs to make this relevant and still have questions about whether it's sufficient, whether it's a sufficient critique. But again, I don't have a concrete counterposition, because he's basically trying to square a very important circle. How do you split and still have unity of the socialist movement? You can't, but you have to like angle at it, like, and because the stuff he says that leads to the split, I think that's all pretty sound argumentation. So what's he gonna do? But
okay. Well, I put on the screen there the Joy of Seth's book. Look at that. Doesn't that get you? Who's getting wet looking at that?
Yeah.
Anyone?
Oh boy. Oh baby.
Let me get some of those sex. Yeah.
I was about to say, at least half of you are math nerds. So.
Yeah.
What is that theory, Tom?
Oh God, it's an attempt to formalize numbers, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
like Hilbert.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the Joy of Hilbert. David Hilbert, when he wanted to formalize mathematics, and then came along Bertrand Russell and fucked them all up with a bit of help from Gödel.
Oh, it's so much fun.
Yeah,
it's true.
Right.
But our categories.
Will we have a look here at Well, we say goodbye to the chat. We'll say who do we have here in the chat? James Flynn,
Yeah,
Luke
let's do it.
Fontes, Benjamin Hanshu, Olivia, Alexi Ibo, don't know who that
Olivia.
is. Trans Revolution, don't know who that is. Tom O'Brien is a sexy looking mother. Constantine, Jake P, Data Lore, Delatera.
I wish we were lifestyle communists. I really wish we were.
Do we have anybody?
Yeah,
Erica.
right?
How's it going, Erica Whelan? All the regulars.
Right.
We actually have an amazing 13 watching now. Oh yeah, we're getting to the masses, ladies and gentlemen. We're getting to the masses. Grant, so we've done 114 pages of 172. So we've got 6 chapters done, 3 to go. So it'll be probably another 6 episodes. Lexi was saying we do it in 4 episodes. Am I right, Lexi? Is it 5 episodes?
I think it was maybe 5. Yeah, I was such a spry young optimist then. No.
I said a minimum
No,
of
it's all
15. So I think it looks like I'm going to be
You're right
winning
on the
this
money.
bet.
Tom,
I'm going to take all the money.
It's been like 6 months, you know? It's been like we've been doing this for like half a year.
I know it's never fucking ended.
It's been, I think it's literally 5. We've been doing it for literally 5 months.
I think, yeah, I've released the 13th edited episode last night,
Right.
and I think I have about 5 or 6 to edit already, and we'll probably include in this one and the next, say, 6 of them. That'll be 8. So we'll have 14 more edited episodes. So it'll be like a 28 episode series.
Hell
Right.
yeah.
Oh, God.
No one's ever read this book this thoroughly. I'm just saying.
I'm telling you, we're giving your man with the Revolutions podcast a run for his money. You know, he does like the next Revolution in 28 episodes. We're like, fuck you. We haven't done the Revolution. We've done all of communist history in 28. Fuck you. That's what I say.
Mike Duncan, please come on if you want.
Mike Duncan, I'm going to try and get him on my podcast.
That would be neat.
Okay. Right, everybody. Thanks very much. And we'll take this offline. Thanks to everybody in the chat.
Yes.
Bye.